All right, folks, good evening and welcome to another edition of Case Report and News. I'm Anthony Weeks, and this evening we are going to take a look at the issue of trade and why trade matters and unlocking the economic potential of Central America and the Caribbean. Again, this is Anthony Weeks reporting for the Caribbean America's Single Economy and the Acapello, which is our new tech initiative. Now, as we gear up for this evening program, we're going to, address the issue of the fundamentals. The fundamental is what are those pillars, if you will, of the the economy of the region. So whether we're talking about the Caribbean or we're talking about the other parts of the Americas, but obviously it's focusing on the Caribbean. We understand that the region has seen rapid growth over the past 15 years, but a number of trends could affect whether the economies can continue to grow. We're going to hear a special presentation by one of the institutions that are, if you will, that are champion the economic prosperity and advancement of the region. And that is going to be on the second half of the program. But before we get into that, I want to be able to share with you some information, some data that I think that would be helpful for you to better understand. In 2017, the CAC countries had a cumulative GDP. And when I say CAC, I'm talking about Central America and the Caribbean. Cumulative GDP of close to $400 billion and comprise more than 65 million people, making the region the 19th largest economy in the world and 23rd most populated. Now, this was the case before the pandemic, mind you. Over the past 15 years, the economies, the number one economies in Central America and the Caribbean recorded an average annual GDP growth of around 4% higher than growth rates achieved by Latin Americans, average and most developed economies, but well below most other developing regions such as the South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa, and countries such as China or India, exhibited average annual growth of more than 5% during this period. However, growth has not been sustained by the CAC countries. Again, that's the Central American Caribbean countries. In fact, only three countries, Costa Rica, the Dominican Republic, and Panama, have grown above the regional average over the last 30 years. And only the former two exhibited higher than the average growth rate in both analyzed period. Indeed, most nations have presented high volatility in economic growth since 1987. Factors that drive the dynamism of the Central America and the Caribbean, what has enabled the CAC region to have achieved faster growth than the rest of the Latin American countries. One of the distinctive factors has been rapid productivity. In the last 15 years, productivity has grown at more than 2% per year, representing more than half, which is 56% to be exact, of the growth of the region's GDP, substantially above the average for Latin America, but still lagging far behind global champions such as Asia's booming economy. The Central American and Caribbean region mostly lag behind others in important indicators such as human capital and innovation and technology. Speaking of technology, this is why under the SETI initiative, the Caribbean America's Single Economy, better known as CASE, acronym CASE, is why our Acapello initiative is going to speak specifically as to what we need to do in the technology space and to be able to harness the resources for purpose of collaboration to really emerge as a region, as a tech hub region, and that agenda is called Acapello. Now, the success of the new economic and social development model requires both commitments from the public sector and the perspective of the private sector. Now, I want to go to, if you will, the presentation on why trade matters for us in this region. And so let's take a look at the data that speaks to that issue of why trade matters. So there are new opportunities for the Caribbean. Again, these are data that came out prior to the pandemic. And so as we look at the data that was created by the World Bank, we are going to see where they give an overview and a summary of just exactly what that opportunity is. It says that trade is essential for Caribbean countries' development and poverty reduction. Given their small market size, they are dependent on exports to produce manufactured products at efficient scale. And given their natural amenities, they rely on tourism as a major spur to economic activity. Trade in the Caribbean thus make an essential contribution to increasing employment and reducing poverty by supporting growth. At the same time, the high dependence on trade also makes the Caribbean economies vulnerable to external shocks. For example, the global financial crisis imposed substantial job losses in sectors such as tourism that the poor rely on for employment. Caribbean countries face a rapidly changing environment for their export, which presents both opportunities and challenges for economies highly dependent on external markets. In particular, the features of the new trade environment include, number one, redefinition of the relationship with main trading partners, including the United States, where the Caribbean export continues to enjoy preferential access under the Caribbean Basin Initiative. And the reason that's important is because the United States is the largest trade partner for the Caribbean, okay, for the Central America and the Caribbean region. And the Virgin Islands, the U.S. Virgin Islands, being a territory of the United States, has an opportunity to position itself where we can harness those external forces or opportunities that the rest of the region can benefit from, and we can be in the U.S. Virgin Islands a facilitator. But we need to be proactive. We need to be strategic. We need to be working alongside our neighbors to be able to do that. And in the European Union, through the recently signed Economic Partnership Agreement, the increasing economic influence of the new growth poles, for example, Brazil, China, and Indonesia, Korea, and Russia, and the redesign of the CARICOM Regional Trade Agreement to implement the Caribbean Single Market and Economy, known as CSME. And I spoke about that yesterday. So the difference between what CARICOM is proposing and what they initiated in 1989 is called the Caribbean Single Market and Economy, the CSME, which is driven by the associated states, member states of CARICOM, the Caribbean Community. The U.S. Virgin Islands, we're not a member state of CARICOM. We have we were given the approval because, again, we are the United States. So whatever deals the United States negotiate, whatever agreement in terms of multinational, multilateral agreements, geopolitical, bilateral economic relationship, we benefit from that. We work in concert with that. And so by virtue of having that, every state in the union has the opportunity to develop its own local state economy and look at foreign trade investment, attracting foreign trade investment, and pursuing foreign market opportunities working in conjunction and in concert with those United States multilateral agreements, bilateral agreements, geopolitical relationships as well. And so we, U.S. Virgin Islands, have an opportunity to work alongside on a parallel track with CARICOM and their Caribbean Single Market and Economy. We have introduced, as we, the SETI, the Cinco Economic Development Initiative, a nonprofit macroeconomic and public policy think tank involving economic development, business development, and community development. We've launched our flagship initiative, major project initiative called Caribbean America's Single Economy, acronym CASE. And so CASE is that initiative designed to bring the public sector and private sector together to be able to reach out to our neighbors and look at how we can participate in the free movement of people and the integration of the economies, of the island economies. But most important, because the Virgin Islands is part of the United States, and we now have an opportunity to be able to help be a facilitator of that, we now have an opportunity to be able to work with the Central American countries and the Caribbean as well. And so that's the opportunity we have. And so when we talk about what CARICOM is doing and what they're doing in terms of they're looking at free movement of people and integration of economy, we'll see an opportunity to be able to collaborate with them, especially on the new law that speaks to the issue of the 2016 United States Caribbean Strategic Engagement Act that speaks to how we're going to better improve and strengthen economic ties and improve trade and commerce between ourselves, the United States, and the Caribbean. And so we can emerge as a participant, as a viable participant in that process, and help to foster and facilitate that process. And that's what the work we're doing as SETI and our Caribbean America's Single Economy. So it talks about the work of CARICOM Regional Trade Agreement to implement the Caribbean Single Market Economy, CSME, as well as a number of preferential trade agreement within the region. These changes are likely to redefine the trading structure of the Caribbean countries, and through this restructuring to have important implication for welfare of these economies. Understanding such implication is critical to designing appropriate domestic policies, responses to changes in the trade environment, but also in terms of eventually reshaping trade agreements and policy. Continuing here on, we see here that the new trade dynamics add old challenges facing the Caribbean region, despite fairly respectable economic growth and high level of openness to trade. Unemployment rates remain very high, averaging 10% for the region over from 2002 to 2009. And poverty reduction has been slow. Over the past 5 years, unemployment rates have averaged near, or should I say, above double digits levels in most countries in the region. And so as we take a look at the countries we're referring to in grouping of countries, we have service-dependent island countries like Antigua, Barbuda, the Bahamas, Barbados, Dominica, Grenada, Jamaica, St. Kitts and Nevis, St. Lucia, St. Vincent, and the Grenadines. Light manufacturing-dependent Caribbean countries, places like the Dominican Republic, Haiti, in the area of agriculture and food dependent. You have Guyana and Belize. They have an abundance of natural resources, which makes them dependent on their natural resources. And then you have, again, what I meant to say that Guyana and Belize, agriculture and food dependency is what they rely on. Natural resources countries such as Suriname and Trinidad and Tobago have those natural resources that they depend on. Now, what I'd like to do is I'd like to be able to go to the tape and play the presentation by the person who is in charge that is going to provide an an overall outlook on the Caribbean. And her name is Alicia Bersina. She's the executive secretary of the ECLAC, better known as the Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean. And so we're going to go to the tape and play her presentation at this point.
Office of Port of Spain, and I'm very happy to acknowledge here our office and Diane Quarles, who is our director in the Caribbean office, and her team, who are practically the responsible for this outlook that I'm going to present today. It's really a pleasure for me to introduce this 2020 edition of the Caribbean Outlook, which is actually oriented towards recovery and resilience in the Caribbean. And of course, we know that COVID-19, although it's primarily a health shock, it has a very significant effect on the economies of the sub-region. And while the Caribbean has done quite well in terms of health, the other side, I would say, the economic cost has been huge and very important. And I have to say that almost all Caribbean countries will contract growth, of course, with the exception of Guyana. And we know that Guyana, due to the very good privilege of having oil, but in any event, Guyana is also going to shrink its growth. But overall, the region is going to fall 6.9%, and excluding Guyana, of course, which is lower than the average of the region. And I would say that the most the greatest challenge that this sub-region is facing is the fiscal deficit, which is huge. It's 2.7% of GDP in 2019, and it was higher than 2018, and it's expected to expand further in 2020. So if you can see at the left-hand side the GDP projections, and at the right-hand side you can see the ratio of public debt versus fiscal balance, and you would see that the economies, the dilemma that the Caribbean countries are facing is that budgets have had to be allocated, and of course there is a danger of liquidity that is coming up as very severe. And I would say that in response to COVID-19 in the Caribbean has made huge efforts. And I really want to recognize the enormous fiscal efforts that the Caribbean economies have done, ranging from 0.5% to 5% of GDP, with the exception of Barbados. Barbados has of course, made a huge fiscal effort of 19.2%. So, but in average, we're talking of 3.9% of fiscal effort. Now, this is extremely important because we also see that financial assistance from international donors to Caribbean countries has been inadequate. That's the name of the word, and there has been a lack of sufficient international resources that are especially difficult, and especially on a concessionary basis. And that's something that we really feel that is extremely important for the Caribbean. We see that the international community needs to come much more to this to help these economies, as they are considered middle-income countries. And this is a huge problem because we're talking about countries that are highly indebted on the one hand, highly vulnerable to climate change. So in total, there has been already some money coming to the sub-region. $4 billion have been channeled to the region in the past months, but the majority has gone to the Dominican Republic, 1.1 billion, Jamaica, and Trinidad and Tobago. So the rest of the economies do need a lot of help. And collective grants and donations to the region of the international community are of a total of 830 million. So there's a need, an urgent need, to address the challenges of liquidity. And I think liquidity is really, I think, the most important issue that Caribbean countries are facing. As I said before, the fiscal balance is negative, 2.7% of GDP. And of course, this has been this is a number, of course, of 2019, and this is, I mean, for example, it has served to create a liquidity crisis that could become a solvency crisis, which I think is the most dangerous thing, because this is like a perfect storm, and this is where we have to make sure that the international community is present and there. Now, we have discussed this before in the Caribbean, in the CDCC, in the Caribbean Development Cooperation Committee, and also in the CDR. We discussed several times, and you said it to us, that borrowing is not an option for the Caribbean. If we see, for example, the total debt in the left-hand side, the percent of GDP, we will see that external. Of course, we have done a structure of debt, and we can see what is the proportion of external and domestic debt, and you can see that in terms of percentage of GDP. You can see the case of Barbados, Belize, Jamaica, etc. So we see that there is a huge problem of external debt and percentage of GDP. So the average, more or less, is like 70% of GDP. And of course, the composition of the external debt is also a very important factor for things we're going to raise later on. And that is, what is the component, the multilateral component, the Paris Club component, which is small, but it's important. For example, for Antigua and Barbuda, for Dominica, it's extremely important. But also the multilateral debt and other bilateral and private creditors. And I'm very glad to have with us Mohammed Mohaiddin, because he's very cautious of the problems that the Caribbean countries are facing, and we can see that debt services in the Caribbean are consuming a lot, close. I mean, in 2019, the service to debt was close to 30% in 2019, and this is expected to increase. And for example, we can see that the highest payments ratio were recorded, for example, in Antigua and Barbuda. Almost 71% of the government revenue has to go to debt service. This is impossible for these small economies to have to destine so much in terms of their GDP, of their government revenues to service the debt. In Bahamas is 51%, in St. Lucia 43.2%. We're going to hear from Prime Minister Alan Chastanet. I thank you so much for being with us. But you see, Jamaica is almost 40%. So we can see that this is why we are so much pushing for this debt debt alleviation in the Caribbean. And also, we can see that there is an important part of debt that is in the hands of private creditors, and that's why we also believe that private creditors should be part of these negotiations. And of course, the largest component of the external debt, which is private sector, is 24.5%, which is a lot. So that's why we believe it's so important to have them in the table to talk about these issues. And of course, ECLAC's initiative is very much related to some of the countries that we see here: Antigua and Barbuda, of course, St. Lucia, St. Vincent and the Grenadines, Trinidad and Tobago, Guyana. So what are the sectoral effects that we see out of these crises? I think we have to look into this, as we did this morning with our document that we are presenting about building the future, a recovery that has sustainability and equality at the center. And I have to say that, for example, in terms of sectors, we can see that one of the most affected sector in the Caribbean is tourism. And we can see that the direct impact in GDP growth on tourism is really going to be between 6.6 and 8.6% contraction. And we have built three scenarios: the optimistic scenario, two scenarios, I'm sorry, the base scenario where we are now, and what is the optimistic scenario and the pessimistic scenario. But in all scenarios, the drop of tourism is very high. And on the other end, on the right-hand side, we see also the direct and indirect impacts of GDP growth of the energy sector. We can see here that two countries, in fact, Trinidad and Tobago and Guyana are going to be very hardly hit. We can see that total impact on the energy sector is expected to be 5.8 in Trinidad and Tobago and minus 11% for Guyana. And again, we have these two scenarios, pessimistic and optimistic. But of course, and also we have calculated the direct impact and the indirect impact, which is also so important because at the end of the day, we are talking here of I would say of a very important point in the value chains that has to be included. Now, what is the impact of COVID on the health sector? I think this is extremely important. We can see that the total economic impact of COVID on the health sector in the Caribbean countries during the first quarter of 2020 has been $260 million. And we have, in certain way, disaggregated the costs in terms of how much it belongs to prevention, how much to testing, to treatment, to infrastructure. And we can see that the majority has gone to treatment, and it represents almost 42% of total expenditures, while prevention represents 25%. So when we combine prevention with testing, we will have almost half of the expenditures have gone to these two components. So, and these costs will probably increase once the vaccine is made available. So that's something that we need to factor in. Now, I think the connected to tourism, the greatest impact of COVID has been on transportation. And we can see here that airlines, which is an option for Caribbean economies, as we know, the insularity, or I mean the case of the Caribbean is extremely important because, as we heard this morning from Dominican Republic and from Belize, actually, one of the greatest vulnerabilities is the question that they are islands, so they need to be connected some way or the other, and one way of connectivity is definitely the airlines. And we know that some airlines are limited in terms of fiscal support, especially those regionally owned airlines that have been having a lot of trouble. For example, Liat has gone into receivership, and this has impacted employment and the movement of people. And of course, if the internationally owned operators would like to resume operations, they might require subsidies in response to social distancing and the unavailability of the vaccine, which is still very uncertain. And of course, the cruises, which is the other mechanism by which the Caribbean islands were connected. I mean, we don't see any option at the moment in terms of the cruise sector activity before the availability of the vaccine. And of course, all this is connected to the commercial shipping because the route consolidation due to the excess capacity has increased during COVID-19. So restarting tourism business is critical to increase demand and to make, again, commercial shipping a cost-benefit sector. So overall, the options are very limited, and Caribbean countries will need to undertake advocacy, lobbying, and brand promotion in the region to increase transportation demand and cost effectiveness. And this, I think, needs a joint voices and collective action from the Caribbean, but of course, from the rest of the region as well. So this is something that I wanted to put on record, that I think the region has to come up to the solidarity of the Caribbean. And of course, the socioeconomic impacts of COVID, we can reflect that in one case, which is very much pointing in the case in point, which is the inequality in access to education. You can see here that the temporary closure of all education facilities is impacting almost 12 million students or learners in 29 Caribbean countries. I mean, we're talking here about the interruption in classes, which is costing already $119 million in 26 countries. And we see gaps, cancellations of assessments, of examinations, gaps in childcare, housework, which is also putting a lot of pressure on women, indirect impacts on nutrition, unintended on healthcare systems, and of course, dropout rates are growing. And of course, we know that this is also potential in terms of child labor, because once they drop out of school, many of them go to work. And this is basically happening among the poorest children and adolescents. And of course, confinement and other pressures on families are pulling pressure on the violence against women. So we definitely believe that this is very important to look into, because this is going to be a source of inequalities, and that's basically one of the skills gap, which is so huge in the Caribbean, is something that we are very worried about. And of course, the vulnerability to climate change and disasters. Look at this. I mean, climate change and disaster shocks are a major challenge. The Caribbean is spending around $3 billion annually in damage and losses, increasing the fiscal burden. We at ECLAC are the ones doing these damage and loss assessments of many of your countries, and we know these figures very well. So there is an urgent need to address climate financing, because many people might think that the Caribbean is highly indebted because fiscal discipline is not there or whatever, but really one of the sources of this fiscal burden is precisely the costs of the disasters and of course the damage and losses and the restoration. So we need to look into this, and of course, how do we factor in disaster risk reduction through preparedness and risk management for building forward better? The Caribbean doesn't need to build back. The Caribbean needs to build forward, because that's the problem with the Caribbean. We don't want to build the bridge in the same place where that bridge was destroyed by the hurricane. We need resilient infrastructure. So risk management has to be part of the strategies of the sectoral sector, especially in agriculture, but also in infrastructure at the coastal areas. We said this morning that many countries of the Caribbean and many people in the Caribbean live below 5 meters below the sea level. So this is a problem. And of course, what are the factors that are required to a jumpstart of the Caribbean economies in the face of this sluggish growth? And first of all, we believe very much, and in line with what we presented this morning, there is an urgency to diversify exports and to expand the sources of international reserves. We know that official reserves are already going down in very important way. So official reserves of at least 6 countries in the Caribbean are below 3 months worth of imports. And this is a source of, I would say, of great vulnerability for the Caribbean countries, because the prolonged border closures and the loss of tourism and energy earnings will exacerbate, importantly, the foreign exchange reserves. And we also see that the current account balance is going to go down from 2.5% to 9.8%. So we are really facing, I would say, inevitably a very important source of problem. And the Caribbean is dependent on remittances, as we know, and this will also cause a loss of the household's income. And I think we are all very worried about that as well. So a major task ahead is definitely how to diversify and expand the trade in both goods and services sectors, and move up the value chain in a meaningful way. So we have analyzed, of course, with the numbers that are available, which are those sectors that have technological intensity in terms of exports for the Caribbean. And of course, which are the resource-based manufacturers, primary products, medium technology manufacturers, and how can we move also in terms of the service trade exports, both in the goods and in the services? How can we move, I would say, a step forward in the value chain in a meaningful way in sectors such as transportation, travel, communication, construction, insurance, I think the Caribbean has enormous opportunities also on the cultural and recreation services and in the government services as well. So I think that we need to work on that, and I think ECLAC stands ready to do that jointly with you, with the Caribbean countries, because geography, of course, is playing a role in this isolation of the Caribbean in relation to the global value chain. So this is where I think the region as a whole needs to come in and definitely step up to the equation and see how this sub-region can take some advantages from Panama, for example, from Central America as well, or for the rest of Latin America as a whole. And the other thing is how to address the declining trends in productivity. I think this is something that we are also quite conscious of, because the Caribbean went from 0.8 trend in labor productivity, GDP per person employed, to minus 0.5%. So we are talking here about the English-speaking Caribbean. Of course, if we go to the non-Spanish-speaking Caribbean, it's even worse. We can talk about from 0.7 to 1% going down. And if we compare this with other middle-income countries, we will see that the Caribbean is much more in a worse situation. So productivity is even higher in other parts of the world with middle-income economies. So there is a very important job to do here in terms of competitiveness that has been in decline. And there has been a mismatch between the skills of the workforce and the demand. And this is where we believe that this decline in the skills has to be addressed. And we need to focus on human capital development and training. And I think also the private sector has a role to play, because it is not only how do we raise literacy or numeracy competencies, but really how to improve the creativity skills to make sure that there is entrepreneurship built in. Now, the other part of the equation is gender inequalities. I mean, if we go into the labor market, we will see that women are worse than men in terms of unemployment. And we see this across the countries in the Caribbean. We can see the rates here. And of course, we see St. Lucia. By the way, Prime Minister, we hope to hear from you. Why is this happening in St. Lucia? 17.2% of unemployment rate versus 14 for men. So what can we do there? Because I think there is a higher levels of unemployment in women. Of course, many of them are participating in the health sector, in the education sector, but they are also getting less salaries in some cases. And the other thing is, how do we improve the gender stereotypes? I mean, how do we make sure that women also participate more broadly in terms of science and technology and in general? I think, how do we close the gender employment gap that I think it's so important and could be a source of growth anyway. Now, we have identified 6 priorities to build not only back better, I should have said here forward better, and one is food security, because of course the Caribbean is facing a very huge problem in terms of imports, because Caribbean countries are dependent on 80% of the food that they consume coming from imports. And this is something that we need a greater level of investment in agriculture and aquaculture. I think ocean economy is one very important alternative. As I said before, also number 2 is how do we promote economic diversification of blue and green investment for resilience building. I think there is a full alternatives for green industry and for build resilience in the Caribbean, also in terms of the infrastructure of the coastal areas and touristic infrastructure. Number 3 is how do we expand the broadband access? This is very important to promote the wider use of digital platforms. It's extremely important because many children are unable to participate in teleworking and teleschooling because there is no sufficient access and connectivity for everybody. So this is something that this is a priority. It's no longer a luxury to have broadband access or digital access. The 4th area is to strengthen risk assessment and disaster management. This is a priority for the Caribbean, and there has to be improved insurance, for example, called the CCRF, and leveraging the community resilience by adapting some practices, indigenous practices that have been there for some time and that can really help the Caribbean countries. The fifth area is how to enhance social protection. There is a need, of course, as we have said in all the other parts of this meeting, that there is a need, an urgent need to provide decent work, job opportunities, social protection, and of course, opportunities to have total access to health, as we know, which is the last area in which we definitely need to, because we already, the Caribbean, as I said before, has spent $260 million in the health sector to contain the spread of the virus, but there is a need, of course, to go beyond that and move into prevention and of course, treatment and tracing. I think tracing is another huge area. So I think these are themes that we need to look. So the way forward, some recommendations, of course, are here. Final perspectives on key approach that I hope you will find useful. Number one is planning. How do we incorporate careful planning in the Caribbean in terms of recovery? How do we do it carefully? And again, we stand ready to help. And planning should be a state policy. That is, how do we ensure continuity, that it doesn't change when the government changes, but also is data driven and inclusive with a very strong institutional framework. And thirdly, of course, how to incorporate this in the national sustainable development plans. We are very happy to see that many Caribbean countries are presenting the voluntary national reports, the VNRs, to report on the progress made or not on Agenda 2030. But I think that we need to incorporate the resilience building as one of the main factors to address the risks associated with health and other sectors. And of course, data capabilities is critical to inform the national planning and also to respond. And we are trying to help many of your countries to build up the National Institutes of Statistics. And this is something that we are already doing. And we feel very happy that the Caribbean first, as we have said many times, we have put the Caribbean first in everything we do in NECLAC, because, for example, in the statistics conference, Caribbean first. Caribbean needs their capabilities, and the rest of the region should help in the process of building up the national statistical systems. So, and we are very happy to be part of that. Of course, how do we improve the enabling environment? No question about it. I think greater attention should be given to industrial policies to revitalize trade through economic diversification and value chain. Such policies there are some sectors that offer some comparative advantages in the Caribbean: food, beverages, cosmetics, cleaning products, cultural activities, and I would say also health. We even did a study on the medical tourism, we call it, and I think it's very important. And of course, there's a need to improve trade facilitation, which is customs, improve port infrastructure, and the expansion of market access. This is very important. I think the Central America and Latin America should open up their markets for your exports. And I think this is extremely important. And of course, to pursue ocean-based industries, including tourism and fisheries. Let me say that, and I'm so glad that Mohammed is with us. Thank you, Mohammed. I know that you're going as the executive director in the World Bank, and I think it's the World Bank. I think so. Yes, and we congratulate you for that, and thank you for being so much there for us, the Regional Commission and the Caribbean countries, because this is what we need. We need liquidity support. What's new, right? We need liquidity support. We need, of course, new SDRs. We have talked about this many times, new special drawing rights. And we believe that if there's an issuance of 500 billion of special drawing rights, the Caribbean will receive 2 billion. And that's very important. We have said that before also. Borrowing is not an option for the Caribbean. So there's an urgent need for debt relief and grant support. So we do need the engagement of the IFIs, and thank you, Mohammed. You're going to be there so you can be a voice for the Caribbean, and we need to ease the debt burden across the sub-region. And of course, to change the eligibility criteria. This is extremely important. Mia Motley Amor has already said that the middle-income countries of the Caribbean, we should stop graduation for the time being, number one. But on the other hand, we should review the eligibility criteria for concessional funding based on the vulnerability of the sub-region. I think this is extremely important so they do not fall in the middle-income traps. And I would say finally, and just to close this presentation, I really believe that we in ECLAC have been working for years on this ECLAC debt swap initiative, and I would say the construction, the creation of a Caribbean Resilience Fund. We have talked about the ECLAC Debt Relief Initiative to promote investments in green technology to build climate resilience, and this will need the establishment of a Caribbean Resilience Fund. And what we're talking about here is that we need an initial capitalization of $6.9 billion, which represents 12.2% of the total debt. It's not that much, and we're talking about a facility, a regional, that will need, of course, member-based infrastructure for sure, and then, of course, GFS and the involvement of the Green Climate Fund in the ECLAC swap initiative and access to concessional and grant resources are extremely important. So let me close by saying that, as I said before, we do need the SDR's issuance and reallocation of SDRs in the region, and of course to expand the G20 DSSI, which is a very important initiative from the G20, which is the Debt Sustainability Initiative, and we would like to see the extension of the term and broaden the scope of the beneficiaries to include multilateral debt and to enhance private sector participation, as I said before, and how to institutionalize a space where this for middle-income countries, and also how do we incorporate innovative instruments to discuss. So I really want to thank you. I think we have made an effort, and I want to thank the Caribbean office and all my team here in Santiago for this opportunity. And thank you all panelist members.